They found them on a Tuesday morning in late September 1963. Two girls, sisters, standing with no shoes on at the side of a country road just outside Harlan, Kentucky, holding hands like they were waiting for someone who never showed up. A truck driver named Earl Simmons saw them first. He said they didn't wave, didn't cry, just looked at him with eyes that seemed, in his words, like they'd seen something so terrible that even God had looked away. Earl would later tell reporters that he almost didn't stop. Something about the way they stood there, perfectly still in the morning mist, made his skin crawl. He said it reminded him of deer he'd seen frozen on the road at night, caught in headlights, their eyes reflecting something that wasn't quite animal and wasn't quite human. But he did stop. He pulled his rig over, the air brakes hissing in the quiet morning air, and he climbed down from the cab with his hands visible, the way you approach a wild animal you don't want to spook. "You girls all right?" he asked. The older one, the taller one, just stared at him. The younger one squeezed her sister's hand tighter. Neither of them spoke. Earl said the silence that followed was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. No birds singing, no wind in the trees, just the tick of his engine cooling and the sound of his own heart hammering in his chest. He asked them again if they were okay, if they needed help, if someone was coming for them. Nothing. Just those eyes, hollow and ancient, staring out from young faces. That's when he went back to his truck and called the sheriff on his radio. By noon, the whole town knew the Dalton girls were back, and that should have been the end of it. Should have been a miracle, an answered prayer, the kind of story that gets told at church and makes people believe in divine intervention. But it wasn't. Because when they finally spoke, when they finally told the police what had happened to them during the 11 years they'd been missing, no one believed a single word. Not the police, not the doctors, not even their own mother. And the reason no one believed them wasn't because their story was impossible. It was because it was too possible, too close, too real. The kind of truth that makes you realize the monsters aren't hiding under the bed, they're sitting at the dinner table. They're your neighbors, your family, and sometimes they're you. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This is the story of what the Dalton girls said happened, and why even now, more than 60 years later, most people still refuse to believe it. Part 09. Tirchi disappearance. It was August 9th, 1952, Saturday, the kind of hot, heavy summer day in eastern Kentucky where the air feels like a wet towel on your chest, and even the dogs won't move from the shade. The temperature had hit 94 degrees by 10 a.m., and the humidity made it feel like you were breathing through a sponge. In 1952, Harlan was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. Population barely cracked 2,000. Most men worked in the coal mines or the sawmill. Most women kept house and raised children. There was one main street, one diner, one church that mattered, and one unspoken rule. You looked after your neighbors because someday you might need them to look after you. The Dalton family lived in a small clapboard house about 3 miles outside of town proper, down a dirt road that turned to mud when it rained. Ruth Dalton had been widowed 2 years earlier when her husband James died in a mining accident. Cave in. They never recovered his body. She was left with 2 daughters, a mortgage she could barely afford, and a garden that was the only thing standing between her family and hunger. Margaret Dalton was 14 that summer. Tall for her age, with dark hair she wore in a braid down her back and her father's serious eyes. She was the responsible one, the one who helped her mother with the washing, who made sure Catherine did her homework, who never complained even when there wasn't enough food to go around. Catherine was 10, smaller, lighter, with blonde hair that curled in the humidity and a gap between her front teeth that made her self-conscious when she smiled. She was the dreamer, the one who read books from the library and talked about leaving Harlan someday, about seeing the ocean or the mountains or anywhere that wasn't here. Ruth sent them into town that morning with a shopping list and 3 folded in an envelope: eggs, flour, a bottle of aspirin, simple things, necessities. The walk was 2 miles down that dirt road, then another half mile on the paved highway into town. They had done it 100 times before. Every Saturday, same routine. They'd walk together, do the shopping at Cooper's General Store, maybe stop at the diner for a nickel Coke if they had any change left, then walk home before the heat got unbearable. Ruth watched them go from the porch, watched them walk down that dirt road with Margaret carrying the canvas shopping bag and Catherine skipping beside her, still young enough to find joy in a Saturday morning. Ruth waved, they waved back. That was the last time she saw them as children. By lunch, they should have been home. Ruth wasn't worried at first. Maybe they'd stopped to talk to someone in town. Maybe the store was busy. Maybe they'd walked slower because of the heat. She set the table anyway, 3 plates, 3 glasses of water from the pump. She waited. By dinner, she was walking back and forth on the porch, shading her eyes against the setting sun, staring down that dirt road looking for 2 figures that never appeared. She walked down to the road herself, called their names into the thick evening air. Nothing came back but her own voice, smaller and more frightened each time. By midnight, she was screaming their names into the woods behind the house, her voice breaking like dry wood, her throat raw, her hands bleeding from where she'd grabbed at branches in the dark, convinced they'd somehow gotten lost, somehow wandered off the path they'd walked their entire lives. The sheriff's department started a search the next morning. Sheriff Tom Braddock wasn't a stupid man. He'd been sheriff for 12 years and had seen his share of missing persons cases. Most of them ended badly. But he'd also seen runaways come home and lost hikers found alive. So he organized the search with the kind of quiet efficiency that comes from experience. 30 men showed up. Coal miners who'd worked with James Dalton, men from the church, volunteers from 3 counties. They brought dogs, bloodhounds from the state police, and they searched those hills for 5 days straight. They walked every trail, dragged the creek, knocked on every door within 10 miles. They searched abandoned mine shafts and old logging camps. They interviewed everyone who'd been in town that Saturday, everyone who might have seen 2 girls walking. Cooper, the man who owned the general store, remembered them coming in. Said they'd bought everything on the list, paid with exact change, and left. That was around 10:30 in the morning. A waitress at the diner, Betty something, said she thought she saw them walking past around 11, but she couldn't be sure. After that, nothing. No footprints leading into the woods. No torn clothing caught on barbed wire. No sign of a struggle. No witnesses. No ransom note. It was like the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole. In small towns like Harland, people talk. And when they talk long enough, the stories start to change, start to mutate into something uglier than the truth. Some said the girls had run away, that Margaret was pregnant or wild or both, that she'd taken her little sister and hopped a bus to Lexington or Cincinnati or somewhere far away from the judgment of small-town Kentucky. People pointed to the fact that Ruth was struggling financially, that the house was falling apart, that maybe the girls just wanted something better. Others whispered about drifters, about men who passed through town in the summer looking for work in the mines, men with no roots and no names who'd disappear as easily as they appeared. There'd been a couple of outsiders working at the sawmill that summer. The sheriff questioned them both. One had an alibi. The other had already moved on, and tracking him down would have taken resources the department didn't have. A few of the older folks, the ones who still believed in things that didn't have names, said the girls had been taken by something that wasn't human at all. There were old stories in those hills, stories about things that lived deep in the woods, things that took children who wandered too far from home. Ridiculous, superstitious nonsense, of course. But when rational explanations fail, people reach for irrational ones. But Ruth Dalton didn't believe any of it. She knew her daughters. She knew Margaret wouldn't run away, wouldn't abandon her mother, wouldn't take Catherine into danger. She knew Catherine was too young, too trusting, too attached to her home and her mother and her sister to leave voluntarily. And she knew deep in the part of her that mothers know things, in that place where instinct lives below conscious thought, that wherever they were still alive. She was right. But she would spend the next 11 years wishing she'd been wrong. Part to W.H. Lumgwerdy, 11 years is a long time. Long enough for a town to forget. Long enough for a mother to stop setting 2 extra plates at the table. Long enough for the missing persons posters to fade and peel off the telephone poles like dead skin. Long enough for the story to become legend, then rumor, then something people didn't talk about anymore except in whispers when Ruth Dalton walked by. By 1963, most people in Harland had moved on. They had to. Life doesn't stop for grief, doesn't pause for unanswered questions. People got married, had children, died. The world kept turning, but Ruth hadn't moved on. She still kept their room the way it was. Margaret's bed on the left, Catherine's on the right, the quilts folded at the foot of each bed the way they'd left them that Saturday morning in August. Catherine's library books were still on the nightstand, overdue by 11 years. Margaret's hairbrush was still on the dresser with strands of dark hair woven through the bristles. Ruth still walked to the edge of the property every evening at sunset and stood there waiting, stood there like some kind of human lighthouse, hoping to guide them home. The neighbors thought she was crazy. Maybe she was. Grief does strange things to the mind, carves out spaces that get filled with obsession and hope and delusion. She never stopped looking. In those 11 years, Ruth Dalton wrote letters to every law enforcement agency in 5 states. She contacted the FBI 3 times. She hired a private investigator with money she didn't have, a man who took her cash and delivered nothing but excuses. She put new posters up every year on the anniversary of their disappearance. She never remarried, never dated, never considered the possibility that they might be dead, because mothers know. And then, on September 24th, 1963, they came back. Not in pieces, not in a ditch, not as bodies pulled from a river. They walked out of the woods hand in hand, wearing clothes that didn't fit and shoes that weren't theirs. Margaret was 25 now. Catherine was 21. But when Earl Simmons saw them on that road, he said they looked younger, smaller, like something inside them had stopped growing the day they disappeared. Their faces had aged, yes, but their eyes hadn't. Their eyes looked exactly like he imagined they'd looked in 1952, the eyes of children who'd seen something no child should see. The sheriff's department got the call at 8:47 a.m. Deputy Marcus Howell was the first to arrive on scene, and his report, which is still on file at the Harland County Courthouse, describes 2 young women in a state of shock, unresponsive but mobile, physically unharmed but psychologically disturbed. Earl Simmons had given them water from the jug in his truck. They drank like they'd never tasted water before, both of them gripping the cup with both hands, draining it, asking for more. But they didn't speak. When Earl asked them their names, where they'd come from, if someone had hurt them, they just stared at him with those terrible, empty eyes. Deputy Howell drove them to the station. They sat in the back of his patrol car holding hands, looking out the window at a world that had changed in ways both large and small during their absence. New buildings in town, different cars, different people. The diner had been repainted. The church had a new steeple. Everything familiar but wrong, like walking through a dream of a place you used to know. The sheriff brought them to the station first. Standard procedure for cases like this, though Sheriff Braddock had never actually had a case like this. Missing persons who came back after 11 years weren't supposed to just appear on the side of the road. They were supposed to be dead or found, or at least have some kind of explanation for where they'd been. They sat in a room with pale green walls and a table that wobbled, and for 3 hours they didn't say a word. Not to the officers who asked them gentle questions. Not to the doctor who checked them for injuries and found none. No broken bones, no scars, no signs of malnutrition or sexual assault. Not even to each other. They just sat there holding hands, staring at nothing. Two women who'd forgotten how to be human. Sheriff Braddock called Ruth Dalton at 11:15 a.m. He didn't tell her what had happened. Didn't want to get her hopes up in case it was a mistake, in case these women weren't who he thought they were. He just asked her to come down to the station, told her it was important, told her to come as soon as she could. Ruth knew. Mothers always know. She arrived 20 minutes later, still wearing her apron, her hair uncombed, her face pale with hope and terror. They led her to the room, opened the door, and she saw them. And the sound she made, the sound that came out of Ruth Dalton when she saw her daughters for the first time in 11 years, was something no one in that building would ever forget. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a cry. It was something deeper than that, something primal, the sound of a woman who'd been holding her breath for 15 days and finally exhaled. She fell to her knees in front of them and cried so hard she couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, could only reach for them with shaking hands and touch their faces like she was making sure they were real. And it wasn't until then, until Ruth arrived, until she wrapped her arms around both of them and sobbed into their shoulders, that Margaret finally spoke. She looked at her mother with eyes that had gone somewhere far away and said, "We stayed because he told us to." That was all. No explanation, no relief. Just that one sentence, said in a voice so flat it didn't sound human, so empty it made the temperature in the room drop. And when the police pushed her, when Sheriff Braddock asked as gently as he could who was where they'd been, why they'd come back now, Margaret looked at Catherine. Catherine nodded. And then they told a story that would haunt every person in that room for the rest of their lives. They said his name was Thomas. They didn't know his last name. Didn't know where he came from or how long he'd been watching them. But Margaret said he'd been standing at the edge of the woods near the road that Saturday in August of 1952. Just standing there, smiling like he knew them, like they were expected. Margaret described him in detail that would later help investigators create a composite sketch. Though the sketch would never match anyone on file. He wasn't tall, she said. Maybe 5'8", average build, somewhere in his 40s but hard to tell. Thinning hair, brown or maybe dark blonde, combed over to one side, clean shaven. Wearing work clothes, denim pants, a flannel shirt despite the heat. He had kind eyes, Margaret said. That's what she remembered most. How kind his eyes looked. That's what made it so easy, she said. That's why they didn't run. He looked harmless. He looked like someone's uncle, someone's neighbor, someone you'd see at church and never think twice about. He looked like the kind of man who'd help you change a tire or carry your groceries or give you directions when you were lost. He looked ordinary, and ordinary is invisible. He told them their mother had been in an accident. He said it calmly, with just the right amount of concern in his voice. Said Ruth had fallen, hit her head, that Doc Patterson had sent him to fetch the girls, that they needed to come quickly but quietly, not make a fuss, because their mother was asking for them and time was important. And because they were children, because they'd been raised in a time and place where you trusted adults and obeyed and didn't ask too many questions, because their mother was the center of their world and the thought of her hurt and alone was more terrifying than anything else, they followed him. Catherine said she hesitated. Said something felt wrong, something in her stomach twisted when he said it. But Margaret was already walking, and Margaret was older, and Margaret would know if it was safe, so Catherine followed. He led them off the road into the woods, down a trail that didn't exist on any map, a path that wound through the trees in a way that felt deliberate, like it had been used many times before but carefully hidden from anyone who wasn't meant to find it. They walked for what felt like hours. The trees got thicker, the sunlight dimmer. Margaret said she started to get scared about half an hour in, started to realize that they weren't heading toward town or the doctor's office or anywhere that made sense. But when she tried to stop, tried to ask Thomas where they were going, he turned around and smiled that kind smile and said, "Just a little further, sweetheart. Your mama's worried about you." And somehow that was enough. Because predators know how to use love as a weapon. By the time they reached the house, by the time they saw what would become their prison for the next 11 years, it was too late to run. He kept them in a house. That's what Catherine called it, though the way she described it, it sounded more like a tomb. It was a cabin, really. Single-story, wood frame, old but well-maintained. It wasn't buried underground, but it was hidden so deep in the hills, surrounded by so many trees and so much silence, that screaming would have been pointless. Margaret said you could scream yourself hoarse and the only thing that would hear you would be the birds. There were no neighbors within miles. No roads except the path they'd walked. No power lines, no telephone poles, nothing to indicate that civilization existed anywhere nearby. Thomas had built his kingdom in a place where kingdoms could exist unnoticed. The house had 3 rooms, a main room with a wood stove and a table and 2 chairs, a bedroom where Thomas slept, and a smaller room barely bigger than a closet, where Margaret and Catherine were kept. The doors locked from the outside. Heavy bolts that Thomas slid into place every night and every time he left the property. The windows were boarded up from the inside, thick planks nailed across the frames, so even if you broke the glass you couldn't crawl through. There was a privy out back, but they were only allowed to use it when Thomas said so, only allowed out under supervision. That first night, Margaret said, they cried until they couldn't cry anymore. They begged him to let them go, promised they wouldn't tell anyone, pleaded for him to take them home. Catherine said she screamed for her mother until her voice gave out. Thomas didn't hurt them, didn't yell, didn't threaten. He just waited until they were quiet, until they'd exhausted themselves, and then he came into their room and sat on the floor and explained the rules. He was calm about it, patient. He spoke to them the way a teacher speaks to students or a father speaks to children. He said this was their home now. He said their old life was over. He said Ruth didn't want them anymore, that she'd been relieved when they disappeared, that she'd probably already forgotten about them. It was a lie, of course. But they were 14 and 10, and they were terrified. And when you're terrified, you'll believe anything that makes the terror make sense. He told them that if they tried to leave, they would die. The woods were full of dangers, wild animals and steep cliffs and mines with shafts that dropped into darkness. He said people who ran from the house were never seen again, that the forest took them and kept them and their bones were scattered under the leaves. He told them that if they behaved, if they followed the rules and did as they were told, he would take care of them. He would feed them and clothe them and keep them safe. He would be their father, and they would be his daughters, and that's how it would be until God decided otherwise. And then he locked the door and left them in the dark. Parfois, teacher us Thomas had rules. So many rules. They had to wake at dawn, no matter the season. Thomas would unlock their door and they would get up and wash their faces in the basin he provided and braid their hair and put on the dresses he'd chosen for them. Plain cotton dresses, modest, the kind worn by girls in fundamentalist communities where beauty is sinful and modesty is godliness. They had to pray before every meal. Long prayers Thomas taught them, thanking God for his mercy and Thomas for providing for them. If they didn't pray correctly, if they stumbled over the words or forgot a line, they didn't eat. They weren't allowed to speak unless spoken to. Silence, Thomas said, was a virtue. Silence meant you were listening. Listening meant you were learning. And learning meant you were becoming better daughters. They weren't allowed to look out the windows, even though the windows were boarded up and there was nothing to see. They weren't allowed to ask questions about the outside world, about their mother, about when they could leave. Those questions made Thomas angry, and when Thomas was angry, people went into the small room. He called it the thinking room. Margaret said the longest she was ever in that room was 4 days. Catherine said she stopped counting after the first night. The room was barely 5 feet by 5 feet. No windows, no light, nothing but 4 walls and a floor and a bucket for waste. When Thomas put you in the thinking room, he would lock the door and leave you there until he decided you'd learned your lesson, until he decided you were sorry, until he decided you were ready to be his daughter again. You couldn't stand up all the way because the ceiling was too low. You couldn't lie down all the way because the room was too small. You could only sit or crouch, in the dark, with nothing but your own thoughts and the sound of your own breathing and the creeping certainty that maybe he'd forgotten about you, maybe he'd never come back, maybe you'd die in here and rot and no one would ever know. Catherine said the thinking room was where you learned what you were made of. Some people, she said, would have gone insane. Some people would have clawed at the walls until their fingers bled or screamed until their throats tore or given up entirely and waited for death. But Margaret and Catherine didn't. They survived, because survival was all they had left. Thomas worked. He left the property most days, gone from dawn until dusk, and during those hours the girls were locked in the house with nothing to do but clean and cook and wait for him to return. Margaret said he worked at a sawmill or maybe a logging company, somewhere that paid cash and didn't ask questions. He'd come home smelling like sweat and pine and diesel fuel, and he'd expect dinner to be ready and the house to be clean and his daughters to be waiting for him with smiles on their faces. He brought them books. Old textbooks, mostly arithmetic and grammar and history. He taught them himself, spending evenings sitting at the table going over lessons like a schoolteacher, quizzing them on multiplication tables and state capitals. He said education was important, that even though they'd never go to college or get jobs or have normal lives, they should still know things. Knowledge, he said, was a gift from God. He brought them fabric and thread and taught them how to sew. They made their own dresses, their own curtains, their own quilts. Catherine said she got good at it, good enough that Thomas praised her, and his praise felt like sunlight after rain because praise meant safety and safety was all that mattered. He never touched them. Not the way people think when they hear a story like this. He didn't hurt them in that way. But he didn't have to. The control was enough. The isolation, the constant suffocating presence of a man who had stolen their lives and convinced them it was love. He called it discipline. He called it family. And in the twisted, nightmarish logic of that house, it almost made sense. Margaret said there were moments, long stretches of time, where she forgot she'd ever had another life, where Ruth's face became hard to remember, where the idea of escape seemed more frightening than staying. Because at least in that house, she knew the rules. At least she knew how to survive. And survival meant becoming what Thomas wanted them to be. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your family? Would you have tried to escape, or would you have waited? The question everyone asked, the one the police couldn't let go of, the one that still haunts this case more than 60 years later, was this: why now? Why, after 11 years of being held captive, did the Dalton girls suddenly walk out of those woods in September of 1963? Margaret's answer was simple, chilling, and somehow worse than anything she'd said before. She said Thomas told them to leave. That one morning, without warning, without explanation, he woke them before dawn and told them to pack their things. They didn't have much. Just the clothes they'd made and a few personal items Thomas had allowed them to keep. He gave them each a pair of shoes, worn boots that fit poorly, and a canteen of water. He walked them to the edge of the property, to the place where the path met the woods, and he stopped. He looked at them the way a father looks at daughters who are leaving home, with something like pride and something like sadness. He kissed them both on the forehead, called them good girls, and said it was time for them to go home. He told them to walk east until they found a road, and then keep walking until someone stopped. He said their mother was waiting for them. He said they'd done well, that they'd learned everything he'd meant to teach them, and now their education was complete. And then he turned and walked back into the woods, and they never saw him again. Catherine said she didn't understand at first. Didn't know if it was a test, if he was watching from the trees, waiting to see if they'd run so he could punish them for it. She said she expected him to jump out at any moment, expected to hear his voice calling them back, expected the thinking room. But Margaret took her hand, and they walked. They walked for hours, through the woods, through the hills, through terrain that should have been familiar, but wasn't, because they'd been gone so long and the world had changed. The sun rose, the air warmed, and they kept walking until the trees thinned out and the road appeared and Earl Simmons' truck came rattling around the bend. The police started an investigation right away. Sheriff Braddock assembled a task force, brought in state police and federal agents. They sent search teams into the hills with the best tracking dogs in Kentucky. They brought in helicopters with thermal imaging. They interviewed everyone in Harlan and the surrounding counties, looking for anyone who matched Thomas's description or knew of an isolated house in the woods. They found nothing. No house where Margaret and Catherine described it. No Thomas. No evidence that any of it had ever existed. The areas the girls described didn't match any known trails or properties. The timelines didn't add up. Margaret said they'd walked east, but the road where Earl found them was west of town. Catherine said the house had a stone chimney, but Margaret said she couldn't remember a chimney at all. They couldn't agree on how many rooms there were. They couldn't agree on what color the front door was. They couldn't describe the path they'd taken or how many days they'd walked or anything specific enough to help investigators find this place that had held them for 11 years. And when pushed, when investigators tried to nail down specifics, both girls would go silent, shut down, stare at the floor like they were somewhere else entirely. The medical examinations were inconclusive. Both girls were physically healthy. No signs of malnutrition, no broken bones that had healed improperly, no scars consistent with abuse. Their teeth were in good condition. Their hair and nails were clean. They didn't look like women who'd been held captive in a remote cabin for over a decade. They looked like women who'd been living relatively normal lives. The psychological evaluations were more complicated. Dr. Richard Moss, a psychiatrist brought in from Lexington, spent 6 hours interviewing Margaret and Catherine. His report, parts of which were later leaked to the press, described both women as displaying symptoms consistent with severe trauma. They had difficulty making eye contact, difficulty expressing emotion, difficulty separating past from present. They answered questions in monotone voices, often contradicting themselves or providing answers that didn't match the questions asked. But Dr. Moss also noted something else. He noted that their stories were too synchronized, too rehearsed, like they'd been telling and retelling the same narrative until it had become gospel. He noted that when one sister stumbled over a detail, the other would fill in the gap, not naturally but mechanically, like actors in a play who'd memorized their lines. He didn't say they were lying. But he didn't say they were telling the truth either. Within 2 weeks, the case went cold. The search parties were called off. The helicopters went home. The federal agents closed their files and moved on to cases with actual evidence, actual leads, actual hope of being solved. Within a month, people started to whisper. Started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the Dalton girls were lying. Part 6 Tieshi Doby, the official report, filed in November of 1963 by the Harlan County Sheriff's Department and co-signed by the Kentucky State Police, concluded that Margaret and Catherine Dalton had likely run away in 1952 and fabricated the story of their captivity to avoid judgment or legal consequences. The report cited several inconsistencies in their testimony. It noted the lack of physical evidence. It pointed out that despite extensive searches by trained professionals with advanced equipment, no trace of Thomas or his house had been found. It suggested that the girls had been living somewhere else, possibly in another state, possibly with relatives or friends, and had invented Thomas to explain away 11 years they were too ashamed to account for. It was, the report concluded, a case of shared delusion exacerbated by trauma and guilt. The psychological evaluation supported this theory, at least partially. Dr. Moss's report mentioned folie deux, a rare psychiatric condition where delusional beliefs are transmitted from one individual to another. In cases involving siblings, especially siblings who'd been close before a traumatic event, this condition could create shared false memories so convincing that both parties genuinely believed them to be true. Another doctor, Dr. Sarah Kemper, examined the girls and came to a different conclusion. She believed they were telling the truth, or at least a version of it. She noted that their physical health was consistent with having lived in semi-rural conditions with adequate food and basic medical care. She noted that their behavior, while unusual, was consistent with long-term captivity and psychological conditioning. She noted that the absence of evidence didn't mean evidence of absence. But Dr. Kemper's report was footnoted, not featured. It was included in the file but not cited in the official conclusion. The local newspaper, the Harlan County Gazette, ran a story in December of 1963 with the headline, "Missing Girls Return with Fantastic Tale." The article was sympathetic but skeptical. It suggested the girls had been living rough, possibly with drifters or in abandoned mining camps, and had invented Thomas to explain away years they were too ashamed to account for. It quoted anonymous sources saying Margaret had always been wild, and that Catherine had always been impressionable. It implied, without saying directly, that the whole thing was a hoax. The article ended with a quote from Sheriff Braddock: "We're grateful the Dalton girls are home safe. As for what happened during their absence, we may never know the full truth." Ruth Dalton never spoke to a reporter again. She brought her daughters home, back to that little clapboard house on the dirt road, and they lived quietly, privately, like ghosts haunting their own lives. Margaret never married, never left town. She got a job at the library in 1965, shelving books and checking out novels to people who whispered about her when she turned her back. She kept to herself. She was polite but distant, the kind of person who exists on the periphery of a community without ever being part of it. Catherine tried once. In 1967, she moved to Lexington, got an apartment, got a job as a secretary at a law firm. She lasted 6 months before coming home. She told Ruth she didn't like the city, that it was too loud, too crowded, too full of strangers. But people who knew her said she'd had a breakdown, that she'd been found one night standing in the middle of a park at 3 a.m., staring at the trees, waiting for something. They lived together in that house for the next 40 years, Margaret and Catherine and Ruth, 3 women bound by something no one else could understand. People who knew them said they were polite but strange, that they kept to themselves, that they never went anywhere alone, always together, always holding hands like they were still those 2 girls on the side of the road. And sometimes, late at night, people driving past the house would see them standing together in the yard, staring at the tree line like they were expecting someone. Persa vet legacy. Why Margaret Dalton died in 2004. Cancer. She was 66 years old. The funeral was small. A handful of people from the library, a few distant relatives who'd stayed in touch, and Catherine, who sat in the front pew and didn't cry and didn't speak and looked like she was somewhere far away. Catherine followed 3 years later, in 2007. Heart failure. She was 65. Neither ever changed their story. In the decades after 1963, they were interviewed 3 times by journalists and once by a graduate student writing a thesis on unsolved disappearances in Appalachia. Every single time they said the same thing: Thomas was real. The house was real. And whatever reason people had for not believing them, it had nothing to do with the truth. In 1989, a reporter from the Lexington Herald leader tracked down Margaret and Catherine and asked them if they'd ever gone back, if they'd ever tried to find the house where they'd been kept. Margaret said no. Catherine said there was no point. The reporter asked why. Catherine said, because Thomas didn't want to be found. And what Thomas wanted, Thomas got. The case remains open, technically. In 2003, a cold case unit from the Kentucky State Police reviewed the file as part of a broader initiative to re-examine unsolved disappearances from the 1950s. They used modern technology, satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar to search the areas Margaret and Catherine had described. They found nothing. No house, no foundation. No evidence that a structure had ever existed in those woods. But they did find something else. In 2008, a year after Catherine died, a hiker stumbled across an old cabin deep in the Daniel Boone National Forest, about 30 miles from Harlan. The cabin was abandoned, falling apart, reclaimed by the forest. Inside, investigators found remnants of habitation: a rusted wood stove, a collapsed bed frame, some rotted fabric that might have been curtains. They also found something else. In the floor of the smallest room, carved into the wood with what looked like a nail or a piece of metal, were 2 sets of initials: MDCD. Margaret Dalton, Catherine Dalton. The discovery made the news. DNA testing was attempted on the fabric and wood, but decades of exposure to moisture and insects had degraded any potential evidence. The cabin's ownership couldn't be traced. Property records for that area were incomplete, and it was possible the cabin had been built illegally on federal land decades earlier. Sheriff Braddock, retired by then and living in Florida, was contacted by reporters. He said he didn't know what to make of it. Said maybe the girls had been there at some point, or maybe someone had carved those initials as a prank, or maybe it was just coincidence. But he also said something else. He said, "I've thought about those girls every day for 40 years. And I still don't know if they were lying or if we just didn't want to believe them. That cabin was torn down in 2010 as part of a Forest Service management project. The wood was burned, the foundation was buried, and whatever secrets it held went with it. Epilogue. So what really happened to Margaret and Catherine Dalton? Was Thomas real? Was the house real? Did they spend 11 years in captivity or 11 years somewhere else, creating a story that would protect them from judgment or consequences or something worse? We'll never know. The truth died with them, but maybe that's what makes this story so disturbing. Not that two girls were taken. Not even that they were held for 11 years by a man whose name no one could verify and whose house no one could find. It's that when they came back, when they finally had the chance to be heard, no one wanted to listen. Because believing them meant accepting that something like this could happen. That a man could steal 2 children, hide them in plain sight for over a decade, and disappear without a trace. That evil doesn't always leave evidence, doesn't always make sense, doesn't always get caught. That sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones we refuse to believe, not because they're impossible, but because they're too close to the truth we live with every day. The case remains open, but no one's looking anymore. No one except the people who heard this story and can't stop thinking about it. The ones who wonder, late at night, if maybe Thomas is still out there, still watching, still waiting, and if somewhere in some other town, in some other decade, there are 2 more girls who walked into the woods and never came back. At least not in a way anyone would believe. Hepes, if this story affected you, you're not alone. Cases like this, real or imagined, remind us that evil hides in plain sight, that predators look ordinary, that sometimes the truth is stranger and more terrible than any fiction. If you're someone you know has experienced abduction, captivity, or abuse, there are resources available. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the Polaris Project, and RAN all provide support and assistance. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Leave a comment telling us what you think really happened to the Dalton girls. And remember, the monsters aren't hiding under the bed. They're everywhere. And sometimes they win.